So, Prince Edward just pulled off something that honestly nobody saw coming. And the way he did it is almost music more interesting than what he actually won. Because for years, Charles had apparently been operating under this assumption. And it's a pretty wild 0:1414 seconds assumption. When you think about it, that as king, he could basically reorganize the family assets however he wanted. Nobody in Buckingham Palace expected a filing clerk's decision from 2007 to become the thing that quietly protected Prince Edward for the rest of his life. But that is exactly what happened, and almost nobody noticed until the numbers started leaking out one report at a time. While the world was fixated on Prince Andrew being pushed out of Royal Lodge, stripped of his titles, and left negotiating for a smaller cottage on the same estate, his younger brother sat inside a 120-room mansion, holding a piece of paper that no one, not even the king, could simply tear up. That contrast, once you actually look at it, tells you more about power inside the royal family than almost anything said in public. Bagshot Park is not a modest home. It is a Grade 2 listed 120-room Tudor Gothic mansion set on 51 acres inside Windsor Great Park, built in 1879 for Queen Victoria's third son. By the mid-1990s, it had passed out of royal hands and into the custody of the Ministry of Defense, used to house army chaplains. When the chaplains moved out in 1996, the building was tired, outdated, and expensive to maintain. The Crown Estate wasn't sentimental about it. There was serious discussion about turning the place into a hotel or a conference venue, because as a royal residence it simply wasn't paying its way. Then, in March 1998, Prince Edward, then the Earl of Wessex, signed a 50-year lease. The terms were unusual for a royal, and they were unusual precisely because they came with real conditions. He would pay £5,000 a year, a nominal figure, but only on the understanding that he would take on the cost of restoring a decaying stately home. He did. Edward put £1.36 million of his own money into the renovation, funds he had earned before he became a full-time working royal, and the total repair bill reached close to £3 million, with the Crown Estate covering the balance. Once the work was finished, his rent didn't stay nominal. It rose to £90,000 a year, and the National Audit Office later confirmed that figure represented genuine market value for the property at the time. This is documented in the NAO's own review of royal property arrangements, and it was reported in detail by outlets including People, which noted that Edward paid market rate for Bagshot Park, while his brother Andrew did not pay rent on Royal Lodge for 2 decades. That comparison is the part that makes this story worth telling, because it is not speculation. It is the same National Audit Office report, cited by journalist Becca Longmire in reporting for People, that drew the direct line between the two brothers' arrangements. Andrew moved into Royal Lodge in 2003 under a 75-year lease that, according to multiple outlets, effectively required no ongoing rent at all beyond a token peppercorn if ever demanded. Edward, meanwhile, had already put his own money into fixing a crumbling building and was paying what the government's own auditors called a fair market rate. One brother built equity through investment and documented compliance. The other lived, for years, on terms that would eventually become a public scandal once his connections to Jeffrey Epstein forced a reckoning and the Crown Estate began pressuring him to give up the property altogether. But the detail that actually separates Edward's position from Andrew's isn't just the rent. It's a clause buried in a 2007 extension that almost nobody paid attention to until royal finance writers started digging into Crown Estate paperwork years later. In 2007, Edward, through his company Eclipse Nominees Limited, paid £5 million upfront to extend his lease on Bagshot Park from the remaining term out to a full 150 years. GB News and other outlets that have reviewed the Crown Estate's land registry filings describe this extension as market-tested, meaning it wasn't a favor, it was a negotiated commercial transaction. And crucially, The terms of that extension gave Edward something Andrew's lease never contained: the right to sell the lease on in future and personally keep the proceeds. Andrew's agreement, by contrast, could only be passed to his widow or his daughters. It could not be sold, transferred, or monetized by Andrew himself under any other circumstance. That distinction, reported by Hello magazine among others, is not a minor technicality. It is the difference between an asset and an allowance. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. Andrew's tenancy at Royal Lodge, however comfortable, was ultimately a gift that existed at the pleasure of the institution and could be quietly ended once he became a liability. And it was, once his conduct made him untouchable in public life, the pressure to vacate began, and by the time reporting on his eviction became public, Andrew had little legal ground to stand on beyond the goodwill of a family that no longer wanted to extend it. He is currently reported to be staying at Wood Farm while renovations are completed at Marsh Farm, a far smaller property where he will permanently reside, a striking fall for a man who once occupied a 30-room mansion on 21 acres. Edward's position could not be more different, and the reason is entirely contractual, because he paid £5 million of his own money for a 150-year extension with resale rights attached. Bagshot Park functions less like a royal favor and more like a genuine legal asset, one that carries real, enforceable protections regardless of how the family's internal politics shift. If the monarchy wanted to remove Edward the way it removed Andrew, it would not simply be a matter of withdrawing goodwill. It would mean unwinding a commercially negotiated, paid-for lease, the kind of legal document that doesn't bend to institutional pressure the way an informal arrangement does. That is the quiet inheritance nobody talks about. Not a title, not an artifact from a vault, but the plain, unglamorous power of a well-drafted contract. This matters even more when you set it against the wider financial picture. Bagshot Park is now estimated to be worth around £30 million, a staggering jump from the property nobody wanted to keep in 1996. Reports from The Sun, later picked up by GB News, revealed that Edward and Sophie have also been earning as much as £130,000 a year by subletting converted stables on the estate as office space, roughly 400 meters from the main house. Critics have called the entire arrangement unfair to taxpayers, and that criticism has some weight. But it also illustrates the same point from a different angle. Whatever your view of the fairness of aristocratic property deals, Edward built financial independence into his position at Bagshot Park in a way that made him far less vulnerable to being managed, controlled, or removed than his brother ever was. It's worth pausing here to talk about who Edward actually is inside this family, because his temperament explains why he built his position this way in the first place. Unlike Andrew, who spent decades operating as though royal protection was permanent and unconditional, Edward has always been the sibling associated with quiet compliance, steady service, and a notable absence of scandal. He took on the Duke of Edinburgh title in 2023, decades after his father, Prince Philip, held it for more than 70 years, fulfilling what had long been understood as Elizabeth II's wish that the title pass to the son who stayed out of controversy. It is entirely consistent with that pattern of behavior that Edward would be the one royal to methodically, legally, financially secure his own home rather than rely on informal royal goodwill the way his brother did. Where Andrew assumed the system would always protect him, Edward built protections that didn't depend on the system's mood. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, factors into this story too, and not only through the house she shares with her husband. Her Anthemion tiara, the piece she wore on her wedding day at St. George's Chapel in June 1999, was commissioned specifically for the occasion by Queen Elizabeth II and constructed using pieces from Queen Victoria's own jewelry collection, according to reporting from Hello magazine and confirmed in Angela Kelly's memoir, The Other Side of the Coin. The Queen, The dresser and the wardrobe. It has been redesigned once. In 2019, ahead of a state banquet for Donald Trump, work carried out by jeweler Harry Collins. Sophie has worn it at multiple royal weddings across Europe over the years, and by most accounts she was considered one of the late Queen's closest and most trusted daughters-in-law, someone who was given personal jewelry, not merely items on loan from the royal vault for official duty. That distinction between a personal gift and an institutional loan is one royal households take seriously, and it is part of why the Edinburghs, as a couple, have generally been treated as a stable, low-controversy pairing rather than a source of tension. None of this means the family is free of friction. Questions about fairness in royal property arrangements have only intensified since Andrew's fall from grace, and journalists have not been shy about pointing out that even Edward's comparatively disciplined arrangement still amounts to a senior royal living in a taxpayer-connected estate on favorable terms most people could never access. The Prince and Princess of Wales were forced to publicly confirm they pay market rent on their own Crown Estate property, Forest Lodge, precisely because public scrutiny of these arrangements has grown sharper. Calls for Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie to give up their own Grace and Favour homes have followed the same pattern. The institution as a whole is under more financial pressure to justify itself than it has been in decades, and every lease, every renovation figure, every redacted land registry filing becomes part of a larger conversation about what the monarchy actually costs the country and who benefits from it. But within that larger conversation, Edward's story stands out precisely because it complicates the simple narrative of royal entitlement. He is not someone who was handed something and kept it by default. He is someone who, faced with a decaying, unwanted building in the mid-1990s, chose to invest his own money to save it, negotiated commercial terms that were later confirmed as fair market value by government auditors, and then, years later, quietly locked in an extension that gave him rights his own brother never had. Whatever you think of the broader fairness of royal property deals, that is not the behavior of someone coasting on privilege. It is the behavior of someone who understood, long before anyone was talking about accountability inside the monarchy, that institutional favor is temporary and legal protection is not. That is really the lesson sitting underneath all of this. Titles can be granted and, in theory, could one day be reviewed or restructured. Public image can be built up or torn down in a single news cycle, as Camilla's decades-long rehabilitation and Andrew's rapid collapse both demonstrate. But a paid-for, 150-year lease with resale rights, negotiated at arm's length and confirmed by the Crown Estate's own paperwork, does not move with the family's internal politics. It sits there, binding, regardless of who is popular and who is not. Edward built himself something durable in a family where almost everything else, reputation, favor, even residency, has proven to be conditional. And when you look at how differently his story and his brothers have played out, that quiet, methodical difference in approach may be the most telling thing about either of them. What remains, decades on, is a house that nearly became a hotel, saved by a prince who paid his own way and asked for very little in return. It's easy to overlook a story like this in a family known for grand titles and glittering ceremony, but sometimes the most revealing thing about power isn't who wears the crown. It's who understood, quietly and early, exactly how to hold on to what mattered to them.